Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on the Census 2020 Planning for Action webinar. We really appreciate all of you taking your lunch break to engage in a hopefully informative session on what's coming up as we prepare for our 2020 decennial census. So the agenda today is pretty action-packed. My name is Nellie Tai. I'm the Civic and Community Engagement Director here at the Michigan Nonprofit Association. And as you can see, I'm doing the quick welcome, and I'm also going to go over housekeeping with you. And then we're going to turn it to Erin, who's going to do more introductions of all of our awesome speakers that we have planned for you. And then Joan will close out with
lead consultant with the Michigan Nonprofits Count campaign with the Michigan Nonprofit Association, working towards a fair and accurate 2020 census. Once every 10 years, the U.S. Constitution requires the federal government to count everyone residing in the United States. The data collected by the census determines the number of seats Michigan will have in the U.S. House of Representatives and is used to distribute billions in federal funds to local communities across the state. Considering the nonprofit sector's access to the populations often missed by the census and the trust that these households have in their local nonprofit organizations, no one is better suited than nonprofits to help ensure that our communities are counted. Today, we are thrilled to have three phenomenal guest speakers joining us to share thoughts on what you need to know for planning for action to ensure that those you serve are counted in the 2020 census. First up, we have Arturo Vargas, who is the Chief Executive Officer of NALEO Educational Fund, a national nonprofit organization that strengthens American democracy by promoting the full participation of Latinos in civic life. He also serves as the Chief Executive Officer of NALEO, a national membership organization of Latino policymakers and their supporters. Arturo is a nationally recognized expert in Latino demographic trends, electoral participation, voting rights, the census, and redistricting. And we are so thrilled that he is with us today. Thank you so much for joining us, Arturo. Why don't you go ahead and get started, and then I'll introduce the rest of the speakers as they start.
Terrific. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for this opportunity to join you. Let me preface my remarks by saying that for the past 20 years or so, I have been a member of the Census Bureau's National Advisory Committee, appointed by both Democrat and Republican Secretaries of Commerce. And I presently serve on the Census Bureau's National Advisory Committee on Racial, Ethnic, and Other Populations Group. So my engagement with the Census Bureau has really been firsthand, and I've had a front row seat in watching the Census Bureau plan for Census 2020, the planning of which began really more than 10 years ago. Next slide. There we go. The first thing about Census 2020 is that this was supposed to be a very different census than previous censuses, much of it being driven by a congressional mandate to the Census Bureau to reduce the expense in carrying out the 2020 census. The Bureau was told that it was mandated to do 2020 without spending a penny more than was spent in 2010 in $2010. That would require a reduction of $5 billion in the overall cost of the census if the Census Bureau were to conduct it the way it did in 2010. So the Bureau for the past several years has been planning some innovations, the most significant of which is asking the majority of American households to respond to the census online. This was supposed to be the first high-tech digital census by providing an internet response option for the first time to everyone. The other major change was that the Bureau has been studying the use of administrative records and other third-party data in order to quite literally fill in the blanks. So if somebody returns the form incomplete or not at all, before sending out an enumerator, which costs money to hire staff and deploy them, the Bureau's idea was to go to other sources of data that are available to it in order to get information from a non-responding household. Data sources such as the IRS, Social Security, Medicaid, etc. The Bureau still is trying to determine which sources of administrative data it's going to use and for which purposes. Our understanding is that this makes a lot of sense to go to other sources of data that exist on the American public. However, much of these data sets may not be complete or accurate and may introduce errors. So we're monitoring this very closely, and some of these decisions will be done by the Bureau over the next year. The Bureau had planned to redesign the way it was going to ask each of us to indicate if we are Hispanic and what our racial category is. The Bureau is not going to be allowed to implement a combined question as it had planned. And we use a two-question format, and I'll explain how that has impact and consequences for different population groups. The other thing to keep in mind is that the Bureau, in order to save costs, is going to be hiring a much smaller workforce for 2020 and opening up much fewer offices in 2020 than in 2010. In 2010, there was at least one office per congressional district. In 2020, there will be 248 offices total as we prepare for 2020. Next slide. The other thing to keep in mind is that in the past 3-4 years, the Bureau has not been able to carry out the vision that I just described of this new high-tech census. First, in part because Congress did not fully fund the Census Bureau's preparations in fiscal years 15, 16, 17, and 18 as a consequence. Many of the Bureau's plans were either modified, canceled, or not being able to carry out at all. One of the areas that will be significantly affected are rural communities. The Bureau had intended to do an enumeration process called Update Enumerate, where it hires enumerators to go out into rural communities. These are households where mail is delivered to a mailbox that is distant from the house or P.O. boxes, where enumerators will go update addresses and then enumerate the household then and there. But in order to save time and money, the Bureau is going to deploy these enumerators to do update leave, where enumerators go update the addresses and then leave behind a census form and a census packet. The other major effect of the lack of funding on the Census Bureau was that the dress rehearsal that is held in the years that end in 8, so this year, and it was held in Providence, instead of having 3 sites, the Bureau only did 1 site. So it only will have a final test run from a single urban area and will not be able to understand how its processes are going to work in rural communities because the 2 rural sites were canceled. And of course, the Bureau has been forced to add a question on citizenship that is still being litigated, and I'll get into that in a second. Next slide. This is what each of us is going to receive, and when it comes for us to express or indicate if we are Latino, Hispanic, and what is our racial category. It's a 2-part question, which is a flawed way of approaching this topic, and the Bureau understands that, but it's being forced to implement this format. The first question we'll ask everybody, is this person of Hispanic, Latino, Spanish origin? The options are no. If no, then you go to the next question. If yes, there are boxes to check off if you are Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban. If you are another Hispanic origin group like Dominican or Guatemalan or Argentinian, you have to write in that background in order to be counted as somebody from that ethnicity. And then you go to the next question, which asks everybody, what is your race? And the options are white, Black, African American, American Indian. There are some Asian categories, Native American, American Indian categories, and then the catch-all, some other race. For the first time, people who check white or Black or American Indian can write in their background. This is the first time that's being allowed. The problem with this format is that many people who are Latino and from, let's say, the Middle East and North Africa, Arab Americans, people from Morocco and Egypt, Syria, etc., the Bureau tells us that we are white. And when we look at this format, we don't find ourselves. So what ends up happening is that if people check white when they're really, let's say, Middle Eastern, we're not able to capture that information about them being from a Middle Eastern background. Or people end up checking to some other race box, which OMB tells us does not exist. So as a result, the Census Bureau has to go back and impute data for everybody who answers some other race because that is a non-existent racial category, even though it's on the form. Next. Other issues that we're monitoring, Stephen Dillingham has been nominated for the Census Bureau directorship, and we're expecting his vote in the Senate, perhaps in the lame duck session. We know that the GAO is monitoring the census and has considered it a high-risk activity. The problem with an online census, of course, is that many people may be skeptical about their information being kept private, and there is still a funding crisis at the Census Bureau, and on these issues we're dealing with. Next. Perhaps the most serious risk to the 2020 census at this point is the last-minute addition of an untested question on citizenship. This is what the question would look like. It asks, is this person a citizen of the United States, yes or no? And there are different ways of expressing the yes. If you're born in the United States, born in one of the territories, born of U.S. parents abroad, or naturalized, and you have to write in the naturalized year of naturalization. This is a question that is used in the American Community Survey. The problem with adding this question is that it has not been tested in a 100% survey of the American public. And the last time a question on citizenship was asked was 1950, and it resembled nothing like what this question is. We just learned last week that the Census Bureau is planning to add a new test in June of 2019, where it's going to test this question among 480,000 households, not to determine whether or not it should use the question, but to determine if what the non-response follow-up procedure should be, and whether or not more enumerators are going to be needed in order to make sure that people who do not respond to the census do so. I was pausing because the computer went blank. Next, please. I lost my connection. Could just someone describe what the next slide is?
Sure. It's describing the 9 lawsuits that are pending.
Yes. Okay. So there are 9 lawsuits pending. There are now 2 in New York, and that trial actually has finished. And it is now, we're waiting for the judge in that case to issue a decision. We do expect the decision perhaps as early as this week. The entire trial has gone very much in favor of the plaintiffs suing the Department of Justice. There are 2 more lawsuits in Maryland and 2 lawsuits in California. Another lawsuit on the citizenship question recently was filed by Epic to challenge the privacy impact by adding a citizenship question. The NAACP has filed a lawsuit alleging that the overall design of the 2020 census is designed to undercount African Americans. And of course, our good friends over in Alabama are suing to remove undocumented immigrants from the reapportionment count. Next. So as a consequence, we have at NALEO a particular perspective on what we should be doing right now on the citizenship question. Most important to know is that there is still a possibility it can be removed, either if the litigation is successful or now that there's been a change in party control of the House of Representatives, whether or not we can, through legislation, force its removal. The other thing that is unclear, and this is because the Census Bureau itself is still making these determinations, is how the Bureau is going to treat census forms that are returned with the citizenship question either left blank or the entire form not returned at all. At what point will that trigger an enumerator visit and some kind of contact through the non-response follow-up? We know many people who are concerned about answering this question do not want to be visited by federal employees. And so we want to make sure that we're not going to be putting people at risk of having an enumerator visit if they're advised that it's okay to leave it blank. And the Bureau itself is really speaking out of both sides of its mouth. On the one hand, it says anybody who does not return a form or leaves questions on blank increases the likelihood that they will be put into non-response follow-up, which may include an enumerator visit, or we also hear the Bureau saying, oh, it's impossible for them to follow up on every single form. They'll do the best they can to follow up. So these are things that we still need the Bureau to make a definitive decision on, something that we expect over the summer or possibly after this June 2019 test that was just announced last Thursday. Next. What we are doing now at NALEO, along with other organizations, we have been able to do some research on how to message about the census. So our research has been with the Latino community. There has been research done with the African American community by Color of Change, the Asian American community by Asian Americans of Anti-Justice, the Arab American Institute with Arab Americans. There's also been the National Congress of American Indians with American Indians. Interestingly, all of us are getting some similar themes in our research. One, that people generally have a positive view of the census. However, whenever the citizenship question is pointed out as something that will be added, there is a great amount of fear and distrust that this information will not be collected, and people are suspect about why the question is being asked. Next, one of the important findings from our survey is that Latinos had an overwhelming preference to complete the census by mail. Even though the Census Bureau is asking everybody to respond online, if certain communities are more comfortable responding by paper, then we should know that that will be an option for everyone. The Bureau is going to mail every household 5 mailings. On the 4th mailing, if a household does not respond, so this will be by 8 April, that mailing will include a paper form. So if people are uncomfortable filling out the form online, they will have a paper option. Next. We also tested 4 messages in our research. One is that the census is convenient, safe, and required by the Constitution. Second message, the census is our civic and community duty. The third message had to do with funding, that the census benefits the community because of funding for schools and clinics and roads, etc. And our 4th message we tested was a resistance, defend the community message. It's a way of standing up to the administration. That message actually fell flat. And the message that resonated most was that there are real benefits to the community, to your community, by being counted. And that was a consistent theme by research being done by the other organizations and other communities. As a result, that is something that we will be emphasizing in 2019 as we start priming the Latino community to participate. Next. The other thing to keep in mind is that there were a few differences by subgroups, as you can see here, and we can make this PowerPoint available to everybody. Next, I want to get to the issue on messengers. Messengers are particularly important, not just what the message is that people are receiving about the census, but who says it. We know that when it comes to this kind of messaging, the people most at risk don't listen to celebrities, to athletes, to sports figures, or even elected officials. The people that are most trusted on something like the census are other family members, and in particular, women in the household, mothers, grandmothers, girlfriends, wives, are particularly effective messengers when it comes to civic engagement in Latino households, and we understand other communities experience this as well. Other trusted messengers are healthcare providers, doctors, nurses, Latino community organizations and their leaders, people who speak for the children or for the schools. These are the people that communities most at risk or have most to fear about the census rely upon for accurate and truthful information about civic engagement issues such as the census. Next. So where are we now? So we're now, it's already 2019 practically. And so the Bureau is about to begin opening all of its offices in those 248 offices throughout the country. It's going to be doing its in-field canvas, address canvassing. That means the final development of the complete list of all addresses in the United States. If your household is not on that address list, you will not get a census form. So this activity by the Census Bureau in 2019 is particularly important to make sure that everybody is included on that address list so that people receive their mailings. The count actually begins next January in remote villages in Alaska, and that's so that people can access remote villages before the thaw. People would literally be in dog sleds beginning the count. And then there'll be group quarters in February. March of 2020 is when the mailings begin to virtually all households in the country. April 1st is Census Day. So on April 1st, 2020, that is what the numbers are supposed to reflect what the U.S. population looks like on that day. So if you live in the United States on April 1, 2020, you are to be counted. So if a child is born on April 2nd, not supposed to be included because April 1 is the day, the snapshot of the American public. Non-response follow-up, so the enumerators, the trying to get people to return their forms, that begins in May, goes through the summer, and the hard deadline for all this to be done is December 31st, by when the Census Bureau must report to the White House the apportionment count to determine how many congressional seats will go to each state. And then the following April 1st, states receive the redistricting data. Next. We are at NALEO carrying out a campaign. Next slide. Oh, to prepare for the census. These are all ideas that we encourage you to undertake to start getting ready, to mobilize your local networks, civic groups, church groups. There are two tools, mapping tools that can be used to identify census tracts that are hard to count. One is by the Census Bureau called Rome. You can do that just by Googling it. Or in the City University of New York, CUNY also has a mapping tool where they've identified hard to count census tracts. So you can actually visually find in your communities the most hard to count areas. One of the things that we are encouraging people to do is to advocate for local funding for census outreach to augment the federal government's effort. States, counties, cities can put in their own money to do their own outreach efforts. To give you an example, Illinois has appropriated $1 million to get this started in that state. California has put in $100 million because they understand they're in the crosshairs of the census. Next slide. Oh, the final thing that I would encourage everybody is we need good people to apply to work at the Census Bureau, to run these offices, to be office managers, to oversee enumerators, and to be enumerators. To work at the Census Bureau, you have to apply online at census.gov jobs, and that link is on the previous slide. If you want to get information from NALEO, census.gov/jobs. Thank you. Next slide. If you want to get information from NALEO, we encourage you to send an email there to censusgotc@naleo.org with subscribe, or to text us census 97779, and we'll add you to our network of individuals who will be regularly updated on census development, and we will be able to share with you the resources and collateral that we're developing so you can adapt it to your local community. And I think that concludes my presentation.
Thank you so much, Arturo. That was fantastic. I know we're going to hopefully get some more questions from folks. Please go ahead and all of the participants, please feel to put any questions or comments in the chat box on the right of your screen, and we'll go ahead and ask those. While we're waiting for a few questions to come in, I have a question, Arturo. If, there is so much going on, right? There's so much information, there's so many concerns. What if, you are a local food bank or a local church? What should you, like 3 easy steps, what should they be thinking about and doing right now?
Well, I would say the first thing is to know you do not have to recreate the wheel. There have been a number of organizations that have been funded to do messaging research, and they're developing collateral. We know that not all messages work in all local communities. One of the findings from our work is that you need to understand the local context. But there are a number of organizations that already have undertaken this research and are developing materials. So we look to resources that are available so that you're not alone, because there are so many people involved in this issue this time around that there is a great amount of support for local organizations to start preparing your information. Think about who are the people who are least likely to want to fill out your census forms, and start identifying who are the messengers that should be talking to those households and encouraging them and informing them about the importance to their local communities of why census data is so important for funding for children's programs, Head Start, clinics, etc. Those are the messages that our research shows resonate the most. And again, I would encourage people to start encouraging folks, good folks, to go and apply for census jobs so that the people who are doing this work really have getting the most complete, accurate of our communities in mind.
Great, that's fantastic. Another question, you also mentioned about the complete count committees. Can you explain what those are a little bit more, particularly on the local level, and perhaps how nonprofits might be communicating with their local governments about that right now?
Mm-hmm. Complete count committees are structures that are set up typically at the state level. Some counties have complete count committees as well as some cities, and these are heads of agencies, individuals who represent major stakeholder communities who are coming together to ensure that at the different levels of government, there is coordination among the different agencies and entities so that there is the best use of resources to reduce redundancy and duplication of effort, and so that everybody knows exactly what's being done and can coordinate the best way possible. In some of these cases, some of these complete count committees are being funded by their governments, and some governments are actually providing small grants to local organizations to participate in outreach efforts. So it's important to find out, is your state, is your county, is your city setting up a complete count committee? Is it making resources available, and how can you participate?
Right, and in line with the resources, in terms of, you mentioned Illinois, making appropriations, certainly California, I know have, and a number of other states, dealing with funding to help their state with census communications and preparations. What have you found in other states that are doing this? What have you found to be the effective talking points or advocacy strategies that have really helped to work with to help the states actually appropriate those dollars?
Absolutely. One of the resources that has been made available by a number of the foundations is that they have funded Andrew Reamer over at George Washington University to update the amount of funding each state receives through federal programs that use decennial census data to determine the amount of funding per year per state. And what has been very compelling is when we explain to state leaders, look, every single person that's missed in our state means $1,000, $2,000 will be lost per year for 10 years. And that adds up for many states to millions, if not billions of dollars of lost funding because people are not counted. So I would encourage people to look for Andrew Reamer, R-E-A-M-E-R, his research. You can find it also on the website for the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. There's links to his research there that shows the actual tangible fiscal impact of what happens when people do not participate in the census.
Right, yeah, and in Michigan it's $1,800 per person per year that's at risk, and I know and Joan will probably talk about this a little bit more towards the end, but there's BeCountedMI2020.com, which is the Michigan Nonprofit Association's campaign on the census website, and it has, as you mentioned, it has Reamer's research on there and some other materials as well. Speaking of the hard-to-count population and people who are traditionally missed, can you talk a little bit more about what populations those are, who they are?
Absolutely. We're talking about vulnerable populations and people who do shy away from contact from government, and people who are not able to themselves be counted. And in that last category are very young children. In fact, very young children ages 0 to 4 is the population group that experiences one of the highest rates of undercount, simply because babies and toddlers cannot fill out their own census forms. They rely on adults. one of the things we learned from our research was when we did a survey of 1,600 Latino adults. One of the questions was, do you have children ages 0 to 4 in your household? And if they did, we asked them if they would include them in their census forms. 11% said no, that they would not. Now, we were not able to tease that out enough, and the Partnership for America's Children is going to be doing more focus groups and research in early 2019 to try to get at that issue. The Census Bureau itself has been studying that issue as well, as to why very young children experience such a high undercount. So that is a major theme of NALEO's effort, to make sure that we educate young parents, guardians of children, to make sure that they know that children are to be counted. Other people who are missed are people who are low income, renters, people who are mobile, obviously people who are experiencing homelessness, people who don't speak English. All of these are populations that always experience a severe undercount, as opposed to people who are much more wealthy, who have more than one homes. In fact, there is a segment of the U.S. population that is overcounted. People with more than one household, for example, one housing unit. Often those families fill out their forms more than once. College students tend to be overcounted because they're counted in the dorms, in the group quarters process, and they're counted by their parents on their household census forms. We care about the people who get missed. We care about the differential undercount, because that's where our communities are adversely affected when people are missed.
Absolutely, and certainly those who are missed, as you mentioned, are often the vulnerable populations, and those certainly are most often served by the nonprofits, and so it's a great place for the nonprofits to be the messengers on this issue. Arturo, thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and we're going to go on to our next speakers, but all of you on the phone, please note that we do have one more section where we'll be asking some questions. So please, again, if anything comes up, and if you do want to ask it of Arturo, we can revisit with him as well, but please make sure you go ahead and put your comments and questions in the chat box. So next up, we're going to hear about what this all means for Michigan communities. Our next speaker is Shannon Gardner. Shannon is Vice President of Community Impact at the Heart of West Michigan United Way. And the Heart of West Michigan United Way is actually serving as one of the 10 census hubs for the Michigan Nonprofits Count campaign, which she'll explain in a second. At the United Way, Shannon leads staff and volunteers in setting and attaining goals related to United Way's mission, vision, and board-approved goals. Thanks so much for being here, Shannon. We'll hand it over to you.
Oh, thanks so much, Erin. I appreciate the opportunity to be on board. As Erin mentioned, we've been deemed as a census hub, excuse me, and one of the things that the Heart of West Michigan is really trying to focus on is how do we identify and support the organizations that have a strong presence in the undercounted neighborhoods. We want to make sure that we can help educate and inform and address the citizens' concerns about the census. And so, Arturo, you mentioned several things that are very important as we need to be focusing on as a census hub. I mean, it consisted of, those people who choose just not to participate in the census, many of them immigration, people who have low confidence in the government, and also, there being fewer census field workers. So when I look at what is it going to take for us as a census hub to really address this issue and to actually make a difference? We looked at the roles and responsibilities, and as you can see, the first thing is that we need to bring together a local advisory group. And one of the things that we've done here is that we have 16 members already. Our first meeting will be in January, and of that committee, we tried to look at who had great relationships, really close, strong relationships with the community, their neighbors, their partners. And so some of those members consist of people that work with Migrant Legal Aid, Urban League, the Refugee Education Center. We also looked at those who were a part of our local community action agency, because we know that they're the ones who are really kind of the grassroots working with those in these various communities. And with an overwhelming response, we got 16 members, and we probably could have more, but it's just, a matter of really trying to get those who are going to be committed to this work. As we're planning, our next steps, it's how do we, really identify people and bring the message home. And it's kind of like, people aren't really talking. They don't want to give out their demographic information. They don't want to share where they're located or who resides in their homes. And so even though these organizations are that we will be working with may have relationships in the community, it still does not mean that they're going to be able to change the mind or the perceptions of those that they're working with. So it's going to be our job as a Census Hub to really, share relevant material and information that people can relate to. So not only is it just a trust in trying to build a relationship or a better relationship, but it's going to be really to have a message that is not a high level, but that is a low level that reaches those in the community where they truly understand. Because if you have a trust issue, you may be able to relate to your local nonprofit worker, but it's still a part of the government. And so there's still that fear. And how can, what we're looking at is crafting a message about how do we deliver that message where they can identify themselves within that message. What does it actually mean to them or their family members or the community that they live in? So we're going to, be really closely providing tools with the recipients that we will look at receiving these mini grants so that they can do some of this outreach work in the community. We will mostly be working closely with them to help track some of the efforts that are being made, and then also doing like a dashboard so that we can show the bigger picture and having an evaluation plan. Our goal really is just to make sure that we're able to tap into the communities of the hardest to count neighborhoods and demonstrate that this is not just a government issue that, we're just pushing papers and we just want you to sign. We really want them to know that we care. We care about them. We care about the services and programs that come into our communities, and that's what really the census is about. And so how do we get that message across is going to be a great task. As Arturo mentioned, it's just so many things that it's unknown. They're very fearful, and they really, the trust is just down. So as a Census Hub, it's going to be our role to really make sure that our advisory group, comprises of representatives from those targeted areas, to make sure that our communications and our outreach is really on track to build those relationships and gain that trust.
Thanks, Shannon, so much. We're so grateful for your leadership as a hub administrator, and particularly your leadership in Kent County. And of course, as soon as we talk about mini grants, there's a question about how do you apply for those. And if I could just really quickly just mention that folks will want to go to the BeCountedMI2020.com website that I mentioned earlier, and you'll see the hubs listed, and the mini grants are allocated based on those regions. And there are 10 total, and you can see that on the website as well. And the mini grants won't be going out until spring of 2020, but the best bet at this point is to contact the people listed on that website for your region to get more information about how it's going to work there in terms of the mini grant distribution. I'm going to go ahead and ask our final speaker to share her wisdom as well. We are going to hear next from Susan Reed. She is managing attorney with the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center. Susan has practiced immigration and immigrant right law since 2003. Her particular interests include the intersection of family and immigration law, the rights of unaccompanied immigrant children, immigrant eligibility for public benefits and programs, and civil rights matters. Susan is also a member of the Michigan Nonprofit Complete Count Committee, and we're so glad that she's here. Susan, I'll hand it over to you.
Sure, thank you so much. Arturo and Shannon covered so much. I've shared some pictures from our work and our advocacy, and I want to just be a little bit more conversational with you. You know, it is such a shame that we are in the position we are in with respect to the citizenship question. You know, Arturo gave us so many critical facts about how we got there and where things might be headed, but you know, 2010 was the best census ever in terms of completeness, and that was without a citizenship question. I've been following the litigation that Arturo highlighted. I thought the trial last week was really spectacular in terms of showing the bad faith that led us here. And really the allegations of bad faith were hardly disputed by the United States Department of Justice lawyers representing the Commerce Department. You know, they sort of defended the case on an administrative law theory that what the government doesn't have to make sense, they just have to have a process. So I remain somewhat hopeful that the litigation can put us in a better position. You know, and we've seen, especially from NALEO, a great community and national view. But, you know, we at the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center, we have to counsel individual clients about their individual interests. And, you know, communities are bringing us in to say, you know, how should individual members of our communities think about what they're exposing themselves to? And so, you know, the question that we're really struggling with is that if the citizenship question is on the census, we as, again, attorneys counseling individual clients, we can't quite use the messaging that it's safe, period. If you look at the top middle slide picture, you'll see a picture of that's me in my tan coat standing next to my client who is a 20-year green card holder who went to Canada for a fun weekend. Went to Toronto for the weekend shortly after President Trump took office and was banned in the Muslim ban from returning home. He happens to be a doctor serving a medically underserved community in Michigan. And for that first weekend of the Muslim ban that was, as it was initially enacted, green card holders were banned. By the time we brought him home, I traveled and met him in Canada and traveled back with him. You know, they were admitting people on a case-by-case basis, but we still had to make quite a case to get him readmitted into the U.S. to perform surgeries the next day in mid-Michigan. And I highlight that story because that really forced me to commit to reminding myself that, you know, to non-citizens, really anything can happen. And that was a real shift in my thinking, and my thinking's informed by it around this issue. And I think of Southeast Michigan's MEMSA communities, Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian communities, and the impact in terms of government mistrust that really all of our post 9/11 policy has had on that community, but certainly this administration's real targeting of that community. So that's why I say that I, at this time, can't use a simple message in the community like safe. I hope I can. You know, as we looked at with Arturo, the law today makes your response confidential. And the litigation around the citizenship question does show us that getting information to use in deportation proceedings really is not the goal of the government, despite some of the other bad faith goals that they have. But alienage or non-citizenship is the government's burden in a deportation case. And so we have to take advising clients to go ahead and admit alienage to the federal government. We have to take that really seriously. You know, a lot of folks have suggested don't answer, but as we learned earlier, don't answer creates a really unpredictable response in terms of the likelihood of an enumerator making a visit and the, you know, high level of discomfort that might create for someone who's already too afraid to answer the question. I did want to underline that, I mean, admitting to being a non-citizen is not the same as admitting to not having immigration status, right? Even green card holders are non-citizens, even though they can only be removed in very specific circumstances, or at least for a weekend, can be banned. It's sort of two sides of the same coin. But you can have immigration status and be a non-citizen. That doesn't make the fear factor go away. So we're in a position now where we will counsel individual clients and we'll counsel our communities around a risk-reward analysis so that they can make a decision for themselves. You know, I think a good way to illustrate this is this is how we already counsel our clients. Have, for example, an undocumented parent applying, considering applying for food stamps for their child. We're able to talk to them about how minimal the risk of making that application and identifying themselves as a non-applicant, even though they're in the household, sharing information about their income that might have sensitive information on the pay stubs. You know, we can counsel them that the risk of that activity is really quite low in terms of it leading to immigration enforcement. Although there are some risks around it, it's really quite low. I mean, I often say, did you drive here, to ask me that question, right? And if the person says yes, I say, well, evidently getting the answer was important enough to you to take some risk, because driving in Michigan, where undocumented people don't have access to a license, is a very high risk activity. So that tells me that you're really interested in getting the right answer to these questions. So these benefits must be really important to you. You know, so I try to help people think through like a risk reward analysis. How big of a difference would having these benefits make in your life or your child's life? That is a tougher issue with the census, and we're going to have to think about how to talk about that. I think we can certainly talk about with our clients and our communities about the high potential community benefit. Again, that $1,800 per person per year. But that's an indirect benefit to a household, or it's going to feel like an indirect benefit. They're not going to either choose to see that $1,800 in their pocket or not. It's going to come in the form of services. It's going to come in a lot of forms. And so in some ways, while we will be able to say that the risk is very, very small, you know, I am concerned that many families won't see the benefit to their household as being high enough to justify even a very, very small risk. We just don't know where we're going to end up, but this is how we're thinking about it. And it is really a struggle given the profound impact that the census does have at the community level, especially on the communities of color that we serve.
Thanks so much, Susan. Really appreciate your honesty and really sharing with us where you all are with your thinking on this right now. And I think it really highlights how truly nuanced really the messaging and the materials are really going to have to be that are really reaching out to the various different hard to count populations. And I wonder on that, Arturo, could I ask you real quickly to chime in? I know that the Census Bureau has been doing some research and looking at messaging as it relates to different populations that are considered hard to count. Can you talk a little bit more about that and just kind of share what's going on in terms of looking at, you know, certainly messaging that might apply to various different groups?
Yes, earlier this year, the Census Bureau carried out its pretty comprehensive, however flawed, research to determine public perceptions of the census and what kinds of messages would resonate with the American public in different population groups. They carried out something called C-Bands, which is a Census Barriers, Attitudes, and Motivators survey. It was sent out to tens of thousands of households, and I think about 32,000 households participated. But the problem with that survey is that it went into the field before the Secretary of Commerce ordered the citizenship question to be added. So there was no opportunity for that survey to ask people about their perceptions of how they would consider participating in the census if there were a citizenship question. Nonetheless, there is some rich data that the C-Band survey has, and some of it's located on their website. And again, it resonates quite a bit with the kind of research that we at NALEO and of the other national organizations have done research in their respective organizations are finding out about public perceptions about the census. The whole notion that the census really benefits your community continues to be the most compelling argument for why people should participate. The other thing the Census Bureau did was carry out 42 focus groups around the country. And it was with different segments of populations, with Latinos, African Americans, different Asian groups, immigrants, etc. The flaw that we saw in the focus groups is that of the 42 focus groups, 4 were among Latinos. They were only in Spanish. And one of the concerns we have is that we know that the vast majority of Latinos in the United States are born in the United States, are English dominant, and we really have very little data, or the Bureau has very little data on the perceptions of the census by Latinos who consume media and their information in English, or predominantly in English. This information is going to be used by their contractor, Youth and Rubicon, YNR, in order to develop the national campaign. And they have subcontractors that has specialties in the different racial and ethnic communities, including African Americans, Asians, Latinos. There is a contractor that is unique to Hawaii and those populations, as well as Native Americans. So we are going to be closely following the development of this communications campaign. But the thing is that we know we need to augment what the Census Bureau is going to be saying to the American public and to our communities, because there are going to be some things that we know need to be said that the Census Bureau is not going to say, which is why we need to make sure that we are coordinated in our own messaging and that we are consistent so that we don't confuse our communities and people understand how important census participation is.
Great, thanks so much. And Joan, I know that Joan Gustafson with M&A is on the line as well, and she's going to be closing us out in a minute. But I wonder if, leading up to the closing, Joan, if you could go ahead and if you want to talk just a little bit more about, obviously Arturo mentioned that there'll be some materials and communications that will be coming from the Census Bureau that will need to be tailored here in the state. I wonder if you want to talk any more kind of about the campaign and the website and resources that are available there.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. As Erin said, and Arturo as well, the research and the information that's being done by a number of the national groups and the Census Bureau we'll be looking at all that. We have looked at a lot of that, and it's our aim here at the Michigan Nonprofits Count campaign to arm our census hubs and our nonprofits with the collateral they need, the messaging they need, and basically all the communications that they're going to need in order to, again, communicate with the communities that we need to get counted. And so, as I said, we're working with a lot of groups, and we have a communications firm and a number of sub-communications firms that will be working on materials. So be sure to continue to go to our website, becounted.mi2020.com. If you go, there's a resource page that lists everything that we've done to date, by the way, is on there and it is downloadable for many communities or for anybody who wants to go on there. Under the Engage page, you'll see the list of all the census hubs, the webinars that we're showing, and also there's a button to click on to get our news and information, which we're now sending out each Monday morning. So you can keep connected to the campaign that way. Unless there's anything else, Erin, did I forget? I just was going to just close out unless there's any other questions anyone had or any other final comments that any of our speakers wanted to make.
I think we're good to go.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Our speakers in particular, I hope everyone found this as valuable as I did. Please save the date for the next webinar. It will be held on March 25th, right now tentatively scheduled from 10 to 11 Eastern Standard Time. Again, check out the website, becounted.mi2020.com. And please, everyone, have a safe and happy holiday season. Thank you.